thank you to everyone who's joining us this morning, and thanks to our panelists who are going to inform us throughout the next approximately 90 minutes. My name is Diana Fox-Carney. I do various things in the climate space, and one of which is I moderate several events for corporate nights, and I'm very excited to be here today because we are talking about an issue that's critical to our climate future. This series, and this is the first of 3 webinars that we'll be hosting over the coming weeks. The series is called Our Zero Carbon Future, Making the Transition Just, a key issue. We're co-hosting with the German and French Embassies in Ottawa. Let me tell you, before I introduce our partner from the German Embassy, let me tell you just how the event today is going to run. We will have an opening address from Chief Dana Tisha-Tram from the Vuntut Gwich'in First Nation. He will be providing an opening address. We'll then have a panel, our 3 panelists to whom I'll introduce you later on, but their names are Allison Ashcroft, Ellen Denise, and Veit Berger, and they're going to participate in a panel. They will be making opening remarks. We very much encourage you to post questions throughout in the chat panel or in the Q&A panel. I will be picking up on those and introducing them into our discussion. So that's how things are going to work today. We've got a lot ahead of us, so let's get going without any further ado. So we have today with us Gerhard Schlaudraff, who is the Deputy Head of Mission at the German Embassy in Ottawa. Welcome, thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Diana. And thank you to the corporate nights also to hosting our climate talks again. It's becoming a tradition that that we like very much. I welcome you on behalf of the Embassy of France and on the Embassy of Germany. This year, we want to look at the practical issues around the energy transition, and we have picked the idea of just transition because it is so much around in the public discussion, and we felt it's necessary to look at the real issues and the facts, because if you don't do that, you get a debate often that is rooted in ideas of basically delaying energy transition than rather of addressing the real challenges. Today, we want to talk about energy poverty and, as Diana said, on November 3rd, on challenges and opportunities for workers and companies and communities. Now, energy poverty is very topical these days, at least in Europe. We see price hikes for oil, gas, and coal not witnessed in decades. And some people have been very quick in denouncing the energy transition as a root cause of this. Just today, there was a comment in the Globe and Mail that suggested something like that also. So the International Energy Agency has argued very convincingly how the main effects, that this is mainly an effect of the rebounds of the economy during the pandemic. But that said, the effect of these price hikes on vulnerable people and groups is just the same, of course. So we should look at the lessons learned of this very closely. After all, we are looking in the energy transition. We are looking at a retooling of our economies at an unprecedented scale. No one has the experience with this, and there will be challenges, and people will be vulnerable. So we want to look at these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for emphasizing the practical aspect of this. The aim of this series is to learn from each other and to learn about measures that have been taken in different places, how they might help address these issues of energy poverty. I think the point you make is energy poverty already exists right now. It has been exacerbated by high prices, particularly in Europe, but also in North America. There is anticipation that some of the measures, at least in the short run, will further increase the costs, the cost burden on relatively poor households, and that may be preparing their building envelope, preparing their houses, for example, for new sources of energy and insulating, etc. The long run trajectory, expected trajectory, is actually cheaper energy, more abundant energy, and cheaper energy. But there certainly is a real hurdle to come across that. So to the extent that we can learn from each other about what's been going on, I think this is all essential to keeping the energy transition on track. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's joining us today. So let's move on now to our opening address. But before that, I would like to make a land acknowledgement, as we do in Canada frequently. So Corporate Knights and our partners, the German and French Embassies in Canada, honor all First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples. As I'm located in Ottawa today, I wish to acknowledge that Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. Thank you. So with that, I would like to pass to Chief Dana Tish-Tram. He is as I said, from the Vuntut-Gwitchin First Nation, which is near the border with Alaska. He can tell you more about his background, but he's worked in various Indigenous organizations in the Yukon and has direct involvement in solar projects in that space. So, Chief, thank you so much for being with us today and welcome to the event.
Good morning, all of my relations, which is an important way in which we introduce and greet one another. I'd like to thank you, Diana, for inviting me to this event, to the fellow panelists, and especially my respects to those listening. It is a large honor for my voice to reach through to all the others, which is not my voice alone, but one that was passed down to me from my ancestors, is the birthright of my grandchildren, and shall serve as a conduit for our lands and the first teachings to us as a species. Also, I speak from our traditional territories of the Vuntut-Gwitchin peoples, 80 miles north of the Arctic Circle, 60 miles east of the Alaska border. We are the most northwest community in Canada, a humble village of 250 people tucked away in between the Crow Mountain and the Porcupine River. And I would like to talk about why we do land acknowledgements, first of all. Land acknowledgements in Canada largely invite our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters into a history that is not populated in social textbooks or our education systems. Those of the lands of the Indigenous peoples who walked on them for centuries. But there is another layer to this, and it is not necessarily to understand the empirical correlations and relationships between the land and ourselves so much as invite us into the rapture of existence. As the air that we breathe gets distributed to blood platelets and organelles in our cells, you cannot discern where air begins and a human ends. To fire, which is the 12 volts of electricity that dance through our brains and through our nerves. To the waters in our bodies in the same ratio as water on the planet, and the earth, the substance that makes us up. When we walk across our lands, we are literally walking upon our ancestors and the future generations yet unborn, as all of these systems have not left the earth, the air we breathe, the ground we walk upon, or the water. They all stay, and we are a part of this beautiful system. So I would also like to broach the subject in some of the unique instances and challenges that Indigenous communities face. Largely across the world, we have been left out of major industrialization, mechanization, and modernization. Ourselves as a rural community in northern Yukon, we do not have any connecting road systems. So everything is brought in either by ice road or by air transport, which serves for a lot of transportational difficulties and logistics. Especially with modernization as well, we lack the technical prowess and a lot of the capacity in which to deliver major paradigm shifts in the spheres of our societies, which is at a deficit, but also a benefit. Our people largely live on the land. The land is our medicine for our mental, our physical health. They sustain us and they galvanize our community under this canopy of not just survival, but thriving, sharing the fresh meat of the porcupine caribou herd or our moose species with young mothers and families. Where the benefits possibly potentially lie is if we have been left behind in major infrastructure development and modernization, then we have the ability to take a shortcut like we have with our solar energy project right into the precipice of technology, which is through disruptive business models, we are able to move away from centralization and empower a community. Our community before contact was a self-governing, self-sustaining, self-renewable, and self-determining community and peoples. I find it interesting that upon contact and with major influences, that all changed. Our remoteness, which insulated us from the major homogenizers of cultures such as televisions and the modern world, which now presses upon our youth through cell phone screens, it gave a lag, and it gave this time for us to be able to determine and establish what our community was going to do to protect our cultures and our way of life, but also how we are going to allow modernization in. This extends itself to the Indigenous peoples in the cities as well, and urbanization. Indigenous peoples in Canada are 5% the population, yet with 634 First Nations, and after 150 years, less than 27 modern treaties or modern agreements in self-governance, as other First Nations are under federal legislation of the Indian Act, we have a lot farther to go. But the cultural elements of Indigenous peoples and our cultural technologies, such as oral histories, which reach beyond empirical education systems and really galvanize knowledge. For instance, instead of reading your history from a textbook, learning it from your elders and how you fit into that is a more wholesome way in which to transfer knowledge beyond just trivia or intellect with modeling in your mind, but knowledge of having that trivia, building those models attached to your heart, which creates that knowledge. Another big part of this is that the Indigenous peoples in urban communities across Canada and across the world, one of our greatest cultural technologies is ceremony and community. Ceremony is one cultural technology that I do not see practiced in the modern world. Perhaps at a graduation, people throw their hats up, get a diploma, but don't really ask where that came from or what that is. Ceremony is an opportunity for an individual to weigh themselves against the morals and the ethos of their community so that they can self-drive their amalgamation and weave themselves into a society, opposed to having predetermined offices an individual must contort themselves into a larger compartmentalized system. At one side, you can see it's almost a sterile, analytic, and very individualist-based aspect, whereas the other is very based and focused. Now, this major shift in the graph you'll see here was around the turn of the century. The major pathogens and diseases that were passed collapsed Native American populations across all of the Americas as our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters began to highly populate and mechanize. The main point is that climate change and this major deviation of our species going out of harmony with our environments did not come simply with the Industrial Revolution's leap in industrial abilities to pollute the airs with methanes and greenhouse gases. Moreover, it was a perspective. It was an imbalanced idea delivered and actualized through technological leaps that allowed our environment to become imbalanced. So in this way, our environments, the world, is now a mirror in which we should see ourselves in this issue. And it is telling us what it is that we need to contemplate as individuals and communities, regions and nations, in which to find these solutions. And as a voice that has been carried through my lands for millennia, a voice and a peoples that learned from the ultimate technology, which is nature, it has taught us that our solutions are within one another, working together with our environments, that there is not a hierarchy in animals or cognition, but there is a balance, a great symphony in the universe, an elegance in its complexity. And from it, the monoliths of our disposition is one of banking on diversity, but rewarding cooperation. We cannot simply leave our work and give our power as individuals to negotiators at COP25, political leaders, industrial leaders. It is in our hands. And community is one of the most powerful tools that we have in coming together. With the Old Crow Solar Panel Project, one single project, we have cut off 1/4 of our community's energy needs. We've created energy sovereignty by having a microgrid system, delivering photons converted to electrons right beside the berry bushes, which our elders still pick from. We are now selling savings to the utility shareholders and have unlocked over $410,000 a year to a community of 250 people. With one single project and a disruptive business model, we have shown the world, we have shown rural communities that we are a major part of the solution. And the Indigenous brothers and sisters, with our principles of renewability and community, are an untapped resource in pushing these things further, because it is not our tools that are to blame, but the ideas in which we wield these tools. And if we have forgotten who we are, then our tools will wield us. Again, Masi Cho for this opportunity to speak. I thank you all for listening, and Masi.
Thank you so much, Chief. I want to, before moving on to the panel, just pause to acknowledge what a moving acknowledgement you made at the start of your speech, and we have many comments to that effect. I think that was a really good starting place for us. And I really appreciated the emphasis that you placed on learning from nature, on the importance of diversity and on collaboration. And sometimes it's easy for us to frame the discussion of what can we do to help those who are suffering. And you've reframed it as it's not about outsourcing solutions to other people. There's different parts of this equation. Yes, the frameworks need to work well. And I know you have things to say about the power purchasing agreements and things like that and how they've helped you. But this is about communities coming together and helping themselves to a good degree. So thank you very much for kicking us off in that inspiring way. I really appreciate that. At this point, I'm going to now move on to our panelists. Chris, perhaps you can put the slide up. I won't wait for the slide. But we're going to, as I said, we have 3 panelists with us, and the chief will also be staying with us to answer questions. But we're going to start today. I'll introduce you to everyone and then pass you to Allison to start. We have Allison Ashcroft. Allison works with cities and their partners on their shift from sustainability and climate action planning to implementation. She does this presently as the managing director of the Canadian Urban Sustainability Professionals group, which is a network of municipalities working in this space. And she has a background in local government and working with Deloitte in financial transactions. So thank you for being with us today, Allison. We also have Veit Berger, and Veit comes from the Urco Institute in Germany, where he is deputy head of energy and climate division. And the Institute is an independent research and consultancy organization on sustainability. And I'm sure Veit can give us a few more details on their particular involvement in this space. And finally, we have Hélène Denis from France. And Hélène is advocacy officer at the Abbé Pierre Foundation. She is, I believe, an architect by background, and she's also coordinator of the Collectif des Associations Unies, which is a collective of 39 organizations working in the homelessness and poor housing space, working on difficulties of housing in France. So thank you all for being with us today. We're going to start with Allison. Allison, what's your perspectives on these issues of energy poverty and how they afflict those that you deal with in Canada? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Diana. First, I'd just like to say that I'm on the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Penelakut First Nation and the Coast Salish people of Galiano Island today. I'm having a hard time following Chief Dana on this one. I was kind of asked to give some more technical terminology around energy poverty. It all seems pretty inconsequential after following that talk. But yeah, I guess I work with cities primarily. And so I guess I wanted to start with talking a little bit about the different terminology that's emerging and evolving in this area around energy poverty. Because while we use energy poverty in the more urban space to talk about, households that are struggling to heat and cool their homes, in rural and remote areas, it's really more about access to clean and affordable energy. And access is basically the issue in rural and remote areas, whether that's broadband, access to quality healthcare and education, access to even clean drinking water, as we see here in some of our Indigenous communities. Also, like Chief Dana said, I think energy justice is probably a more accurate term to be used in particularly in Indigenous communities, because the rights to independent power production are the right to self-determination. And so in the issue with Indigenous communities where there's a denial of access to clean and affordable energy because of historic relocation and underserving those nations, the right to self-determination and the right to the independent power production is really important and is an energy justice issue more so than an energy poverty issue, which I think some would take offense to as a term. So, I mean, when the term energy poverty is used, a lot of time people misunderstand that as just being purely about being in income poverty. And what we found through the work that we've done, so we've done a lot of sort of number crunching, which is why I say it's a little hard to follow, because I came from it from a top-down perspective, taking census information to try and really understand and tease out what energy poverty looks like across Canada down to even the neighborhood level in our cities. And so what we see is energy poverty affects both rural and urban communities in very different ways. You're far more likely to be in energy poverty if you're in a rural community, but because the majority of Canadians live in urban communities, we have more Canadians in urban communities in energy poverty. based on 2016 census numbers, about 20% of Canadian households are living in energy poverty, or 2.8 million households. I would argue that that number has probably gone up quite a bit since 2016. And when we get the new census numbers in 2023, I think we'll see that. Both because of increasing energy rates, as we all know, but also because of greater job loss, more precarity to income and housing that we're seeing, exacerbated by COVID, but also just this growing inequality that we've also seen, I think, in the last 5 years around housing affordability. So energy poverty can manifest as, a lack of access, like I said, to clean and affordable energy. It could be a lack of thermal comfort, both being able to heat and cool your home. It can be experiencing disconnections and arrears and the punishing penalties and fines that come with reconnection. And it could be a lack of agency to improve your home. So a lot of renters don't even have, they don't have the agency to make home improvements. And so all of those can be qualitative ways to talk about energy poverty, because again, I said we're coming at this from a top-down perspective across Canada. Some of the smaller communities like Bridgewater, Nova Scotia have done some great work going into community and talking about and learning about how energy poverty manifests in their communities. But because we were trying to do something really large in scale, we really relied on the data. And so for that, we sort of came up with a proxy for energy poverty being these high energy cost burdens that you talked about, Diana. And so there isn't a formal definition of energy poverty in Canada, or high energy cost burden. So what we came up with, based on what's being used in the UK and otherwise, is twice the national average. So if a household is spending 2 times the national median, we say that they are experiencing energy poverty. And the average Canadian household back in 2016, at least, based on our data, spent 3% of their after-tax income on energy. And so we said, if you're spending more than 6%, we consider you to be in energy poverty. And we also measured greater than 10% of after-tax income, or 3 times the national median, and greater than 5 times the national median at 15%, to see really deeper and extreme extents of energy poverty. So what we did see, again, rural and urban hits both. You're more likely, if you are in, when the formula is energy costs over income, obviously your income level is going to, the lower your income, the more likely you're going to be in energy poverty. So for sure, if you're in low income, you have higher likelihood of being in energy poverty. But because, again, the majority of Canadians are not in low income, we actually have more households in moderate income who are experiencing energy poverty. That's relevant because a lot of our energy programs are income qualified. And so a lot of those incentives might not be available to these moderate income households who are experiencing these high energy cost burdens. We also saw really big differences across the country. So by far, Atlantic Canada sees the highest rates of energy poverty. So if 20% of Canadian households are in energy poverty, we're looking at upwards of 35 and 40%, and as high as 45% in Prince Edward Island. That's because of lower incomes and higher costs of energy. There's still a lot of oil being used in Atlantic Canada. I'll just end with saying, we did also pull demographic information so we could start to look at what the equity implications of energy poverty are. So going beyond the economic inequities, what were we seeing amongst racialized communities, amongst recent immigrants, and amongst Indigenous communities? And when I say Indigenous communities, I mean in urban Indigenous, because the census often leaves out a lot of the Northern Territories and land-based Indigenous communities. So what we saw in all of those cases, and pretty much across all of our large metro areas, was disproportionate rates of energy poverty for racialized households, recent immigrant households, and Indigenous communities. In particular, with Indigenous communities, what we saw was twice twice the national or twice the city average in cities across Canada of reporting energy poverty as well as need of major repairs. So we know that homes on reserve are desperately in need of rehabilitation, but what our report also shows is that would be the case in our urban Indigenous households as well, that they're also in need of major repair. Some cities have far greater disparities amongst recent immigrants and amongst racialized households, and we have reports that go into great detail on that. So I'll leave it there and put some links into the chat that show some of the data that we've analyzed and the reports that we produced, as well as the mapping tool that you can go on to see your own community and start to understand better how energy poverty manifests in your community and who's most affected by it. Thanks very much, Diana.
Thanks so much, Allison. That's a really good introduction to some of the complexity of this issue. And, you know, it is a factor of incomes, of energy cost, of building envelope, of all sorts of things where you end up on this. And it certainly was a surprise to me that it's worst in Prince Edward Island. I would have thought it'd been worse in a far colder place in the country, but you made sense of that all for me. So I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions for you, but let's come now to Hélène and ask you how much of that you recognize in France, what you heard about Canada, and what's going on in the places you work in France, and how you're beginning perhaps to address some of these issues.
Thank you very much, Diana. Thank you to everyone for being here and listening to us, and thank you for the other panelists for very, very good introduction to what I'm going to say. So as Diana said, I'm working at the Fondation Abbé Pierre as an advocacy officer on energy poverty. The Fondation Abbé Pierre is a national organization which objective is to enable all destitute people to have access to decent housing and dignified life. So we haven't been working energy poverty for a long time, but I think it's very important to remind you the context of environmental transition and social justice in France before going further. You might have heard of the Yellowvest Movements, which have influenced a lot of policy making in France since 2017, and truly traumatized our policymakers. It's a protest movement that emerged spontaneously in France in 2018 actually, to demonstrate against the increase in the price of fuels resulting from a new green tax, with absolutely no alternative to help the poorest to face these new environmental transition, new policies. It was in a context of fiscal and budgetary policies that favors the rich and penalize the poorest with the freezing of social benefits. So it was really obvious that the increase in the energy prices would provoke protest, which took the form of the Yellowvest movement. So to respond, the new tax was cancelled. The President Macron launched the Citizen Climate Convention. Again, just explain quickly, it's an initiative that brought together 150 citizens drawn at random from the French population and aims to define structuring measures to achieve, in a spiritual of social justice, a reduction in greenhouse gas emission. So as a social and environmental problem, the fight against energy poverty in France face the same issues as we faced 5 years ago with the Yellowvest movement. In a country which counts 10 million of people considered as poor, energy poverty in France concerned nearly 12 million people, so 20% of the population, which we count them as people who can't afford to heat or cool their home, people who say they're too cold or too hot, or people to say people who live in such condition that it just there's absolutely no exit door to solve the problem. So it was still absent from public debates 15 years ago, but the notion of energy poverty is actually receiving increasing attention with the increase of energy prices worldwide, increasing precariousness linked to the economic crisis, but also the increase in heating and electricity expenses linked to the COVID-19, the many confinements, and the rise of awareness on the poor quality of insulation in millions of homes. People being locked in their home realize how bad it was to be in a non-insulated, non-efficient home, and how hard it can be for many people when the home can make them ill. So there's many ways to fight energy poverty. I'm not going to talk about the associative initiative here because there are plenty, but I'm more going to focus on the public policies. So there's two schools really. There is the emergency help, mainly to help paying the bills with something we call Check Energy. It's an energy voucher which 5.5 million people receive every year. It's in place since the Yellowvest Movement, with an average amount of 150 euros per year. It's absolutely necessary to prevent energy cuts, help facing the increasing energy price, but the numbers are actually not sufficient. It was completed with an extra 100 euros last month to face the spectacular increase in energy prices. But when a lot of people in energy poverty pay nearly 2,000 euros of bill every year to pay the electricity, 150 euros can seem a little underscaled. So to complete that, there is also a measure to prevent energy cuts during the winter. So from October to March, it's not allowed for energy provider to cut electricity, but it's absolutely possible during the summer. So in order to fight against energy poverty, in the long term, the priority is really to eliminate the 5 million energy inefficient housing that we call in French passoire thermique, which basically literally mean energy calendar. So it's very easy to understand why. Its houses are very uncomfortable, unhealthy, and very costly, and concerns half of those energy inefficient houses are inhabited by low-income households, nearly 2 million, and half of them are owner of their homes or are in the power to renovate them if they can. So the importance of renovation for the climate and for the poor people is really consensual, and is really the classic end of the month, end of the world measure, as these energy-intensive homes are responsible for a very large share of greenhouse gas emission. So renovation then have a lot of economic, health, social, environmental benefits, which will make any public investments really worth the efforts. But however, in France, the ambition to massify is there, but it's confronted with many obstacles. The number of renovation, even though the government has very ambitious goals, the renovation are very, very slow to rise. The renovation is not efficient enough, meaning like a lot of subsidies encourage small gestures as changing the pump, changing the windows, which doesn't really change the efficiency of the renovation, change something in the energy poverty or in the greenhouse gas emission. The renovation remains too expensive because even with subsidies that leave you with only 35% left to pay, when a renovation costs 40,000 euros, when you're on minimum wage, even spread out with a loan is a sum that is unthinkable. And even a loan is not possible for those households that the bank don't want to solve. So to our great satisfaction, the conclusion of the Citizen Climate Convention that I've talked a little earlier were very ambitious. You know, the 150 citizens have been working together to try and come up with measures to solve the transition in a just way. They were very ambitious with the renovation of all French buildings by 2040. That was the main measure, with better public subvention, but also recommending to go beyond incentive levels by setting a progressive renovation obligation that would force certain owners to renovate their homes as early as 2024. So that was very ambitious, and that was something that climate and anti-poverty organizations were carrying for quite a long time already. And so we are very much in line with this conclusion. Then the Climate and Resilience Law, which was supposed to translate the proposals of the citizens in the law last spring, so in March 2021. It's been the subject of an unprecedented joint advocacy work between anti-poverty and climate organizations, which is a very, very big step forward that never really happened before. I mean, that not on that scale. We really agreed to carry the citizens' measure together, and in particular, the general obligation of ambitious renovation on the owners of energy calendar, energy and efficient housing, with important social accompaniments. because we really believe that the ecological transition in the building sector requires a greater degree of public intervention through obligation, adapted to the different public and the level of performance of the housing, starting with the renovation of the most energy-intensive housing inhabited by those who need it the most, so poor people living in energy calendar. So to respond to the fear that this obligation to renovate would give rise to discontent among the yellow vest of housing that could actually happen if the obligation took place, the solution really lies in increased public aid to low-income households, justified by the multiple private and public benefits I was telling before, and that could be generated by these projects. So from then on, this obligation to renovate would appear for what it is really. It's the obligation for the public authorities to make effective the right to a decent housing for all. This obligation would not then appear to be liberticide or punitive, but it would be the pursuit of a general interest meeting a private interest, which struggles to express itself so much because households have a preference for the present, which dissuade them from launching themselves into pure future projects. It's only natural. And contrary to what is sometimes heard or feared, the most modest are not the victim of energy transition. They are not the victim of energy transition that would leave them by the wayside. No, they are really the eternal victim of inaction. They are the eternal victim of the absence of real energy transition. Because in the vast majority of cases, it's not ecology that is punitive. It's the absence of ecology that is punitive. The most modest are not victims of rent increases in the case of energy efficient housing. They are the prisoners of the inefficient homes. And it's this way that we want to see it. But unfortunately, there are sometimes also the perfect excuse to explain the lack of voluntarism of political leaders. Indeed, for example, in this particular case, the government seemed to approve the proposals of the Citizens' Convention, and they pretend to implement them. But then the President of the Republic finally admitted before the citizens that he was opposed to a general obligation to renovate, invoking the absence of a sufficient renovation aid policy for owners in order to not penalize the poorest. So what I mean is that seeming to take advantage of his own lacks, the government then transformed this admission of the shortcomings of its own policy into a justification for not acting further. So in the Climate and Resilience Bill, it's already a very big step forward. Don't get me wrong. But in this bill, in this law, only landlords are assigned the obligation to renovate their rental properties. They used it, it's actually clever, is by including thermal performance standards in the minimum criteria for renting a house. But the problem is it has relatively distant dates and with obligation that are ultimately not very restrictive. Since housing declared indecent simply opens up to possibilities for tenants to turn to justice to demand work or rent reduction, it really never really occurs because someone who's rent in difficulties don't really go to justice to try and get what they want from the tenants. They're not in a dominant position that would let them do that. So however, I will try to conclude, I'm sorry, I'm quite long. So that was not a very big success for us as anti-poverty and climate organization, but we'll really continue to advocate for more ambition because we're really motivated by the Citizens' Climate Convention conclusion, which has really shown that citizens, poor or rich, once armed to deliberate, were not all reluctant to energy renovation or ambitious environmental measures if it was accompanied by social measures. And I think that's what we need to remember. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hélène. That's, it's a fascinating story what's taken place in France, and I think the Citizens' Climate Assembly and what really came out of it into policy and what fell away is a story that we can all learn from. And you've described important processes of joint advocacy, which are lacking in some places, the Poverty Coalition and the Climate Coalition coming together. This is a clear win-win space, as you also described. I mean, but ambition in all the countries that we're talking about, and I think that Veit will probably agree this is the case in Germany, is not matched by measures that get us there. And it's not it's not just financial incentives, basically. I mean, those typically don't add up, but the problem with home renovations is that they're extremely disruptive. There's not enough skills. There's all sorts of other reasons on top of already difficult financial calculations. And some of you may have been at the event that we hosted in the previous series with our German colleagues describing efforts in Germany, which probably unique amounts of money have gone into this in Germany, and you still haven't completely cracked it. So with that, let me pass to you, Veit.
Yeah, thank you, Diana. And thanks for the invitation to share some thoughts from my perspective on this very important topic. So I'm a researcher. I work a lot with ministries in Germany. So we consult the German government in more or less improving the policy framework for the energy transition, or the Energiewende, how we call it in Germany. And here I mainly work on the heating sector. And so the key question that we need to answer is, how can we design a policy mix which is effective and fast enough really to allow us to achieve the targets, but at the same time, how can we ensure that the burdens, and here we talk mainly about the financial burdens, but also the benefits that are associated to the reduction of greenhouse gases, are allocated in a fair way. And what is a fair way? And just to start with the first slide. So sorry, I brought some slides, 3 in total. What you see here is just it's development of the greenhouse gases in Germany and the targets. Just to make it rather short, so we see a decrease in the German greenhouse gas emissions. We see that we have rather ambitious targets. So we have a politically adopted target of becoming climate neutral until 2045. So that's on the table. But if you look at the curve, so the development of the curve looks as if we will easily reach the targets if we continue as before. But this is not the case. This is not the case because most of the low-hanging fruits have already been harvested, and now we really need to address to be honest, the very expensive potentials. So we have replaced many of the inefficient appliances. We have renovated many of the worst performing buildings, and now we really need to get into the very very cost efficient mitigation potentials. Helen talked about. We talk about when you insulate a building really to a very low or nearly zero energy standard, then we talk about 40, 50, 60,000 euros, which is a huge investment. And this also is, I think you need to be honest on that. At the current energy price levels, some of these investments are not compensated by the energy cost savings. So, and that's the huge challenge we have to take. Next slide, please. Of course, we have a lot of policies. So we have a very rich policy baskets. We have regulations, we have economic instruments, we have information and advice, but we also need to raise the questions when we design these policies. What is the social impact of these measures? To what extent are different consumer groups burdened or relieved by these measures? And how should these measures be designed to ensure a just transition? And just to make one example, for instance, if you have a regulation in place that requires building owners to insulate their roof, or to replace the inefficient windows in favor of thermal insulation windows, then you always have to ask, and you have to find an answer to the question, who should bear the costs? Who should take these investments? I think it's quite obvious in the case of owner-occupied buildings, then of course it's the building owner. But in the case of rented buildings, who should do the investment? Should it be the building owner, why the building owner? He's the owner of the building, so he's responsible for the building performance. But there's also a kind of rationality to put this burden, at least partly, to the tenant, because he's the one who's benefiting from the energy savings that are linked to the insulation of the building. So these kind of questions need to be answered by policies, and this is not this often. This is a rather tricky job. Final slide. I would like to provide one specific example also from the building sector, which tries to also to work out a little bit the importance of these kind of analysis that we do. It's about the social aspects or the distributional effects of CO2 pricing. In Germany, we have implemented or introduced CO2 pricing in the building sector and in the transport sector in the beginning of this year. We start with 25 euros per ton, and this is increasing over the next years. And so what you see here on the two graphs on the right part of the slide, what you see here is some analysis for the different income groups. So the different deciles, which you see here on the horizontal axis, they reflect the distribution of the income. So the first decile reflects the poorest, the 10% poorest. So the first and the second and the third decile, so on the left part of the graph, of the above graph, that really reflects the poorer part, or the poorer households. On the right side of this graph, you see the richer households, so to say. And the upper graph shows the tenant rate of the different deciles. So the tenant rate increases as income decreases. So in other words, the poorer a household is, the more likely it is to live in a rented apartment. I think that's quite obvious. The poorer households just don't have the money to buy an own apartment, a single family house. So they normally rent, so they are tenants and they pay a rent. And I think it's also quite obvious that the richer have more money, and normally they live in either own apartments or they even own a single family house or a double family house. So that's not really surprising. The graph below shows the different financial impacts of CO2 pricing. So the bar charts, the two blue bar charts, they reflect the absolute financial burden of CO2 pricing for the different households. And I think it's also quite obvious from the perspective of the absolute financial burden. The richer households, they have a higher absolute financial burden after the introduction of CO2 pricing. Why is this the case? They have a larger living space that they need to eat. They often have more appliances. So for them, they need to pay more in absolute terms per year. But the relative financial burden, so the relative financial burden relative to the disposable income, the relative financial burden is much higher for the low income households. That means that relative to their disposable income, so their available income, the poorer households pay more for CO2 than the richer households. And in this case here, for instance, when we implement a CO2 tax in the range of 125 euros per ton, a very poor household would have an additional financial burden in the range of 2.5% of his disposable income. And this is really an additional burden for these kind of households. And so for them, the CO2 price really has a greater impact for their daily life. And that is something that needs to be taken into account when you implement such a policy. So as Helen said, you can implement these kind of climate policies, but at the same time, you need to think about policies, how to compensate, in particular, the poor, in order to create acceptance for these kind of policies, but from the financial perspective, in order to really have a fair policy mix and a fair climate policy mix. At the moment, we also have a discussion who has to pay this CO2 price in the rental sector. So by default, the CO2 price is paid by the tenants, because the tenants pay the energy bill. They have the gas bill, they have the oil bill. But you also could leave the CO2 price with the building owner. And there's a good rationality behind this, because it's the building owner who takes the decision whether to insulate the building or not, whether to replace the fossil-fueled boiler in favor, for instance, of a heat pump or a biomass boiler. That's his decision. So the price signal should be with the building owner. But this is also something which needs to be adopted, which need to be agreed upon, and this is policies. So that was a very brief spotlight on some of the discussions that we currently have in Germany. I think it's really important always to have both sides of the coin together. You need to have effective climate policies, but at the same time, you need in particular to address the question, how can I create some kind of just transition in order to not to put too much burden on the poor households. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Your last chart that you had up there is fascinating, because obviously the point behind carbon pricing, and that's certainly the tool that's being used in Canada, the point is that it's going to change people's behaviors. As you've described it, the people who have, in a sense, the highest incentive to change their behavior because they have the highest relative burden are the poorest group. But you've also described a situation where there's not much they can do, and they are prisoners, as we heard, because either they don't own their building, their tenants, well, but probably both combination, they don't own the building and they don't have any additional resource to invest the capital cost required to lower their ongoing heating, cooling costs, etc. So we're really in a situation here that is challenging. I guess I wanted just to start by linking the two sides and asking whether, notwithstanding the importance of kind of top-down measures in policy terms and incentive terms, whether in any of the three countries we are seeing more community, any innovation from community level, and obviously there is, there are some distributed energy systems and local solar and other things like that. But what's coming up from communities to help address this? And just I'm going to tack a second question onto that is, when you talk with people, as all of you do, how aware are they? I mean, how much are they pushing back against the prospect for green energy because they fear it will put them in an even worse position? So how much can they help themselves in this space with the right support, and how much of a threat is this, I guess, to the energy transition? And do we come back to this yellow vest situation where without measures being taken, the whole thing is derailed? So I don't know who wants to come in first on either of those questions, but I'm gonna look at Helene, because you're in the middle of my screen. Can you give any examples in France of communities doing interesting things?
Well, I don't think for now, as I said, the obligation are not in France on everyone. It's not a general obligation. Now the obligation is on the owners, and we start to actually have some kind of movement against that new measure, obviously. But for now, it doesn't rise very much. I mean, obviously, if the obligation becomes general, then we need a lot of subsidies, but also maybe where the concerns rise is on the the housing sector, the construction sector that is not really ready to undertake this movement of renovation. That is very, very important. So I think the concern lays more on the technical aspect of it, because in the communication of the government in France at the moment, the government is actually communicating in a way where they say we will have to renovate, but we will do it together. For now, it's not a concern yet.
Thank you.
But
Allison or Avite, do you have any thoughts in this space?
Yes, maybe again from a bit from another perspective, also from the policy perspective again, but on the local level. I think what communities can do is giving guidance. So you have to imagine we have in a city like Freiburg, where I live, we have, say, I don't know exactly, 50,000 buildings. So we have more than 50,000 building and apartment owners, and they all need to take individual decisions into the future, and they need to take a decision that somehow fits to the target and to our target picture, how the heating sector looks like in 20 or 30 years. And all these decisions also have a link to the infrastructure. So when I invest in a new gas boiler, I'm connected to the gas grid. So when I switch to district heating, I'm connected to the district heating grid. So from my perspective, what would be very helpful is when, and this is about urban planning, how we call that, when communities start to urban planning process where they really identify for small parts of the city, for districts, for streets, which kind of heating source and which kind of infrastructure is planned, or is the best choice from the top-down perspective. So I live, for instance, in a five-family building in the middle of the city. So if I would know that the district heating company is planning to install a district heating pipe in my street in the next coming 5 years, then I know what to do. But I don't have this information, and so I think it's about providing guidance. At least that's one puzzle piece in the broader picture.
Can I, Alison, I know you've put some comments in the chat. I want to come back to Chief Tisha Tran, because one of the things that's been important, I understand, to your solar journey has been having a supportive off-taker, so you've generated resources for the community and a supportive policy environment for that. Do you have any lessons that you can draw out of that you could share with us?
Certainly so, and that would be specifically around these climate mandates. And I really want to support Allison Ashcroft's comments before, as for our First Nation, it wasn't necessarily hard to achieve the IPP, which is the Independent Power Producers Policy Framework. We've gotten major commitments now with the Parliament in Canada declaring a climate emergency, as well as the Yukon government. So it's really about reaching across the table with these mandates, because you can understand, for instance, from utilities or other people who are basically looking at staying in the black in the bottom line with their dollars, but there's a way to satisfy both of these. And so by getting an order in council and by setting up the IPP policy framework, from there we were able to leverage our backstop agreements and our electricity purchase agreement, which uniquely is selling electricity back to the shareholder, saving monies. And that's where we're generating monies that are going to empower biomass, and we're now looking into wind energy, all of the rest. But the main thing here is that when I saw a commitment from the Canadian government to get all rural communities off of diesel generation by 2030, I very quickly went to the national body of Indian bands, which is the Assembly of First Nations. And at a special chiefs assembly, they passed, and I put forward, tabled a resolution for the very same thing, getting rural communities off diesel generation by 2030. So now we have a commitment from the federal government, from a national body of Indigenous peoples, and Old Crow has the EPA and IPP as template of documents with a disruptive business model that shows and guides this energy. It's one of those rare instances where it's a win-win-win. And so what we have now is a kinetic energy and a small push, and watch these documents roll across the country in one fell swoop, empowering through policy and through political mandates, which govern a lot of the utilities and the intricacies underneath to really move communities past older and antiquated diesel generation into a future. But this is the same thing that we see a lot around the world. There are a lot of city councils in Canada, such as Vancouver and even in the Yukon, who are doing this as well. So even for community groups, there's a lot of power in finding mandates from your provinces, territories, regions, municipalities, and really leveraging these kinds of innovations at a community level and broader as well.
I mean, that's helpful. It's the policy certainty and the ability to kind of lock that in seems very important. And the idea of regulation, I mean, Helen, you talked about this idea. I've never heard before of an obligation around renovation as opposed to just the incentives and potentially the subsidization around renovation. And, but if we're going to get, clearly this, we're all talking in the context of, in Canada, a legislated commitment to get to net zero, and we can't get there without the building sector being there, and we can't get there unless we bring people along in this space. And using this as an opportunity to increase the quality of life of these poorer deciles, in addition to meeting the climate objectives, is really it's a great thing. But I do think it takes regulation, not just incentive. And I guess, but the challenge is getting regulation sort of over the line. There's a reticence around regulation, including in Canada, because it comes with obligation and it accountability and transparency and things like that, if you have targets. So, Allison, I don't know if you have any thoughts around ways to hasten this in urban communities with specific measures.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a tug of war between the emergency and hastening action with being intentional and impactful. And I think we need to see more localized action. We need to see a shift and a sharing of power and resources to the local level, where people know what is necessary and what is going to both drive down greenhouse gases in their community, but also ensure that it's the benefits of that are equitably distributed, and those who are being most impacted by climate change are experiencing the greatest burdens are prioritized and targeted for access to those benefits prior to others. I think we need to be more again intentional and acknowledge the structural racism within our systems, and ensure that we are looking at disaggregated data when we're making our moves, The just transition in terms of workers, as an example, often focuses on those who have worked in oil and gas, and those are predominantly white men who've worked in oil and gas. So while I am in full support of needing to transition those workers, they've enjoyed some very large, very significant incomes for a very long period of time that women and people of color have not had access to. So I think when we talk about the just transition, we need to be focusing as well on new people entering the clean energy industry, in addition to those who need to transition out of the fossil fuel industry. And I guess the last thing I would say is, we talk in some of our guidebooks and some of our work with cities around taking a targeted universalism approach. And that's a term that's come out of UC Berkeley's Othering and Belonging Institute. And that really is saying, if we have a universal goal of eradicating poverty, of ensuring everyone has the right to housing that is healthy and affordable, and, addressing the climate emergency and building climate resilience, if that's our universal goal, then we need to recognize that we need to take a targeted approach to how we're going to achieve that, which means that we need to be unapologetic about distributing resources unequally, right? So we're not going to distribute resources equally across provinces or equally within a community. We are going to recognize that there are injustices that are longstanding, that have disadvantaged people for a very long time, and that we need to be placing extra resources into those households and into those communities first. And then from the perspective of meeting our Paris Agreement commitments, we need to be focusing in, if we're looking for mitigation potential, we need to be putting a disproportionate amount of resources into urban centers and into those urban centers where there is high carbon intensity, particularly around the electricity grid. So 4 cities in Canada make up a quarter of all the emissions from electricity generation: Saskatoon, Calgary, Edmonton, and Halifax. We need to get those grids clean because those cities are limited in what they can do around building decarbonization, until which time as those grids are clean. Thank you.
We're having some interesting chat in the panel there, but I think one point you make, which is extremely pertinent, is this first point about who gets the attention in this energy transition thing. And in the next event in this series, we are talking about those whose jobs are potentially being displaced, which is quite geographically focused in this country. And I think those people are typically more empowered and more ready to try and disrupt the energy transition for others. Whereas the group that we're talking about here today are often without a voice and suffering, have been suffering for a long time, possibly view this with trepidation, but also there is a greater upside. The good news is that there is a greater upside if we can solve their problems, and if we can get to a stable, cleaner, more healthy, and ultimately cheaper grid, then that works. But we have a huge journey to get through to get there. And there's been a question about, constraints on upgrading houses, or a comment, which come in terms of lack of, high cost, but lack of skills, lack of, appropriate grid level connections, inability to get information, all sorts of things. Everyone suffers with this. In Germany, Veit, are you, or in Germany or in the EU more broadly, is there a discussion around greater regulation and obligation? And I will say that, there are, I know, jurisdictions where, for example, new hookups to natural gas are not allowed. For example, in the Netherlands, and the UK has come out yesterday saying, I know that's not in the European Union anymore, but saying that they're going to ban regular natural gas heating systems from, I think, 2035. And those things, hopefully will shift the needle, but also need to come with this envelope to support poorer families. What's happening in Germany?
So we have discussions about more regulations since not decades, but since many years. But in the end, we end up, because that's the political consensus, in putting more and more money into the funding programs, and do not really try to, the policy sector is not really brave enough really to implement regulations. And I think here the European level can play a major role. So they have put on the European level, we have now on the table proposals for many legislations for the building sector, for the renewable sector, and here they try to implement more regulations. For instance, for the building sector, in Europe we discuss an instrument which is called minimum energy performance standards. A couple of countries have implemented them, and just to make it very, very brief, and minimum energy performance standards, for instance, is regulation where you regulate that, for instance, each of the worst performing buildings, you need to classify them somehow due to the energy standard, needs to be refurbished until, say, 2030 to a certain minimum standard. And then you have a rather long period where every building owner can prepare for that. You can identify the best time when to do that. Normally you try to combine these energy renovations with normal refurbishment or renovation works. And the same applies for the mobility sector. When you now say, okay, we need to stop bringing on the market normal fossil fuel burning cars in the year 2035. Or when you say we phase out coal-fired power plants in the year 2035, then you have long periods really to prepare these and to work on these transformations, which, and we need to be honest on that, which are huge. Many people will lose their job and many new jobs will create it. And you need to somehow accompany these kind of transformations. But if you allow longer time periods for these transformations, I think then you can succeed. But I think it's important really to take these decisions now.
Thank you, Veit. On that note, I'm going to thank all the panelists and all the people who've joined us here today. It's clear that we've got a long way to travel in this space, but I think the granular work that's being done by Allison and others, and the inspiration that we've been given by our colleagues from Europe and also by Chief Tisha Tram really set us off on a good pathway. So thanks for being with us today. I hope you will join our future events in this series. And I'm going to pass now with my thanks to Toby Heaps, CEO, of course, of Corporate Knights. Thank you, Toby.
Thanks, Diana, and thanks, everyone. This was a really inspiring and informative session for me that will have me reflecting, and I think a lot of our attendees and participants for some time. We heard from Gerhard at the beginning that the spiking energy prices are being blamed on the energy transition, but it's more in this case due to the rebound from COVID. But what we're seeing now is a prelude to what could happen if we do mishandle the energy transition, which is all the more reason for investing smartly with a lot more intention in the energy transition, so we can get to a point where we have cheaper, cleaner energy that is less volatile. We heard from moving words from Chief Tisha Tran, bringing us some perspective that nature is our mirror, community is power, and an empowering message that disruptive business models can enable us to leapfrog old, centralized, dirty systems for clean, decentralized systems that strengthen sovereignty, which is exactly what he and his community has done with the Old Crow solar forest, solar energy farm, one of the most northern communities in Canada. We heard from Allison, who's crunched the data on this, that 1/5 of households, and this was mirrored in the EU statistics, live in energy poverty. That's something that's even more pronounced in racialized and Indigenous communities. So 1 out of 5 people are losing right now, and subject to potentially losing even more if we don't carefully move forward with better intention on the energy transition. We heard from Ellen that the carbon price hits hardest on those who have the least power to do anything about it. And that's part of the reason why we saw the yellow jackets in France some years back. And it's a movement that probably poses the greatest threat for the speed of the energy transition, and also for the coherence of the energy transition being aligned with social justice. We heard from Ellen that we need a step change of public support so that we can have a mass retrofits to free prisoners of energy poverty. This is about freeing people who are not always having the largest amount of means possible. It's not about constraining. We heard from Veit, who reminded us that in Germany now, the climate protection is constitutionally protected. We heard from him, the key question we really need to ask ourselves as we proceed forth in this energy transition is, what is the social impact? More pointedly, how do we ensure that we don't make life more expensive for those who can least afford it? And there are many good ideas that were put forth on that topic here. Some of them will be inside the energy transition, and us thinking thoughtfully about how we proceed with it to cushion the impacts and make life more affordable for those who are having a hard time getting by, not less affordable. Some of it will probably be outside of the energy transition envelope, broader tax reform, and a lot of it will be with the intent and the power of us to come together as a community to pour our precious resources and our money into solutions, and really having an eye for letting the decentralized solutions to flourish. And so thank you so much for all of you for sharing your wisdom, and everyone for joining in. And we're looking forward to continuing this series coming up on November 3rd, where we'll be looking at the topic of making the just transition just. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks, Diana, again, for doing a beautiful job at bringing everything together. And have a great rest of the week for everybody, and take care.